Welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Susan Ware. I've started this series because college students in my religion classes at UMass Amherst consistently say that they wish the public could hear the civil, fact based discussion of religion that we enjoy in class. Today, for episode one, I'll look at the question: was America founded as a Christian nation? The answer is both yes and no. Let me preface that by saying that we will be addressing the beliefs of the Europeans who came here. And it's perfectly fair if someone wants to dismiss them because of the genocide against Native Americans that followed in their wake, or if someone wants to dismiss them because their descendants tolerated slavery. That is not our task today, but I don't want to pretend it's not there and that it doesn't have its merits. So, looking at the Europeans who came over here, the key fact is that things had changed drastically between 1620 and 1776. In 1620, the British who landed at Plymouth Rock were Protestants. They sought a strict theocracy of the elect with an economy based on sharing. In 1776, though, the answer to our question was clearly no. Protestants still had power, but they shared it with Quakers like William Penn and rationalists known as deists like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. Deists, such as Voltaire, were especially popular in France. In both cases, these pivotal generations were responding to events in Europe, which shifted drastically in the 150 or so years between those momentous years. Today we'll look at 1620. Next time, 1776. In 1620, very strict Protestants arrived here seeking a uniformly Christian community. The government, they thought, would be a theocracy. The word of God would be the law of the land. The economy would involve the voluntary surrender of all property to hold all things in common. They came here to flee persecution. The 17th century saw bloody battles between Catholics and Protestants all over Europe. In France, Protestant Huguenots were massacred, and some of them were able to escape to Germany. In Ireland, Protestants ignited conflict that lasted a long time when they took over Catholic land in the north. They moved right in and established Ulster Plantation in 1609. The earliest English Protestants took the risky boat ride to the western shores of the Atlantic in two waves. About 100 of them came in 1620, and then 20,000 arrived in 1630. Nearly half of the first 100 died. Who were they? Most were Presbyterians, heavily influenced by John Knox in Scotland. Their Christianity, though, is not a type that anyone is defending in today's culture wars. They did seek a theocracy, and they wanted everybody to surrender what they owned to create a communal pot of funds. Above all, they wanted a return to the Bible. In their view, the Catholic Church had introduced rituals and institutions that were never mentioned in the Bible. Almost all Protestants believed that. These Calvinists went farther, though. They opposed Christmas, Lent, and Easter as non-biblical. The first war on Christmas, you could say. They were right that these holidays adapted events in the life of Christ to pagan practices in antiquity. Christmas is on the birthday of a pagan god who was worshipped all around the Mediterranean, and Easter was taken from Ishtar, a Babylonian fertility goddess who was adored on the spring equinox. The early pilgrims also did not seek a conversion experience rooted in freely choosing faith in Christ. This distinguishes them from modern-day evangelicals. Yes, one might have a conversion experience, but nothing was really free for them. Calvin had been an extremely anxious man. He needed a God that had complete control over human history. So he posited that God had predetermined who would be saved, and this constituted a society of the elect. A new anxiety might easily plague a Calvinist. How can I be sure that I am among those elected for salvation? And how can I be sure my neighbors think that I'm among those elected for salvation? The Calvinist answer was to work really hard and to live ascetically with no frills and no thrills. This would demonstrate my election. Believing that their fellow Calvinists who landed on these shores were among the elect, the Puritans envisioned a society in which these saints shared all that they had, in imitation of Jesus' apostles in the biblical book of Acts, where Jesus' brother James oversees an early movement known as the Jesus movement. Everyone would sell their things to contribute to a common fund so that nobody went hungry. That's why Massachusetts and Virginia are called commonwealths rather than states. In the original Christian vision, the wealth would be held in common. For reasons I could explain later if you ask nicely, their vision does not warrant the label Marxist. Even the Tamer's socialist connotes a lot of taxation and regulation, which were not on the minds of those ocean voyagers. At the same time, though, what they envisioned had nothing in common with the competitive consumerism of today's America. Their sharing reflects communalism, not individualism. They went further and conflated biblical models that didn't entirely agree. And this will be a theme that we'll see again and again. The Bible consists of books written over hundreds of years. It doesn't always agree with itself. So they conflated biblical models, paying lip service not only to Jesus' apostles and their small economy of sharing, but also to a society modeled on ancient Israel. While Christ's apostles surrendered their property to feed those with nothing, the ancient Israeli model ensured that everybody owned enough so that nobody needed charity. That golden age of theocracy in Israel began under King David, around 1000 BC. It was a rare time in Jewish history. The 12 tribes were united and they ruled themselves. Most of the time, they were divided between the 10 tribes in the north and the 2 tribes in the south. And most of the time, other people had invaded and ruled over them, even killing lots of Jews and sending them into exile. In the ancient Israeli society under King David, people had private property, but everyone had enough to survive with dignity. In Galilee, which had lush, fertile soil, that meant owning a small farm. Think Norway, not Russia. If some families started to accumulate wealth and others grew desperate, the Jubilee tradition from the Torah would restore balance. The Jubilee tradition required everyone to forgive debts between Jews, to free prisoners, and to return land to families who had held it at the beginning of that 50-year cycle. The Jubilee was to be practiced after 7 cycles of 7 years. That brings us to the 50th year. In the book of Luke, Jesus announces his ministry by declaring that the year of the Jubilee was at hand. The Jews are now to honor the Jubilee. Indeed, Jesus quotes from the book of Isaiah to that effect. When Jesus lived in Galilee, the return of property was especially significant. Urban investors, both Jewish and non-Jewish, lent money to farmers to buy seeds, and they charged high interest rates. The Torah forbade Jews from charging interest, especially exorbitant interest, of their fellow Jews. So towns instituted non-Jewish third parties to mediate loans. If the farmer couldn't pay back their loan one year, and it's only a matter of time before there's really bad weather, that farmer entered a condition called debt peonage. That meant the investor seized the farmer's land, made the farmer a sharecropper on what had been his land, and the investor took the wife and children of that farmer as slaves in his own household. Then, as now, debt ruined lives. When Jesus asked in the Lord's Prayer to forgive us our debts, he meant it. He meant it concretely, and he meant it locally and directly. My freshman year in college, when I heard my first lecture on the Jubilee tradition, I nearly fainted on the floor. I had just flown into Cambridge from Edmond, Oklahoma, where Christianity and capitalism shared thrones in the royal palace of the mind. With a convert zeal, I thought the Jubilee tradition solved all problems. Surely any sincere Christian, I thought, would create something comparable in their own country today. Now, the Jubilee is not perfect. You could say it's unfair. It creates a credit freeze. Who's going to lend money when they know they have to forgive that debt in a set number of years? And we never hear about those freed prisoners. Maybe they created danger in the society. But the Jubilee preserved group unity, and that was paramount in Judaism. Jews have long been a small confederation of tribes in a region of frequent border wars. They were often outnumbered, massacred, and driven from their land by hostile neighbors. The vast majority of Israeli history in the Bible consists of subjugation to outside rulers, be it Assyria, or later Babylon, or later Rome. Had those threats to their very survival been coupled with internal division based on inequality of wealth, it's hard to imagine that Judaism would still be here today. So, the first European immigrants to our East Coast fled England's persecution to pursue biblical models of a perfect society. How bad was that persecution in 1620? It had been very bad indeed, and some had already fled to Holland. Holland was as tolerant then as it is now, but the persecution in England was easing up. Until 1612, Protestants in England faced grave danger. Anglicans held power, and they would mutilate and execute Protestants. They whipped them and held them in stocks in the public square like this. They slit their noses, they branded their foreheads. But there had been no burnings or other executions of Protestants since 1612. The straw that broke the camel's back for those Protestants was King James's Declaration of Sports. It was a pamphlet distributed to preachers all over England in 1618. The Declaration of Sports allowed people who attended church to have some fun on Sunday afternoon. They could enjoy archery or dancing, for instance. They could engage in, quote, leaping and vaulting, Morris dances, and maypoles. It says that women could carry rushes to the church for the decorating of it. Now, let's be clear. The Puritans did not want anyone leaping or vaulting. The elect, after all, were known by the fact that they worked compulsively and lived prudently, minimizing both pleasure and expense. Their suspicion of pleasure is a psychologically interesting element of Puritanism, with ancient antecedent in Christians like Paul and Augustine. They distinguish the virtuous spirit from the troublesome flesh. Judaism and Hinduism, the two earliest of the modern religions, show that it's possible to have religion without that suspicion of the body. That is a topic for another day. With time, the Calvinist dream of a New Jerusalem and a biblically based economy, presumably in Boston, would meet its match. Working hard and spending little generates an embarrassment of riches. So many early Protestants got rich. Their names are slapped all over the buildings of the first universities in this country. Competition developed too in building wealth. Think of a competitive and individualistic marketplace, more Wall Street than Plymouth. After all, anxiety over being elected spawned conspicuous consumption. The sociologist Max Weber claimed that anxiety created a Protestant ethic that actually accounts for the rise of capitalism in Western countries. To be clear, flaunting wealth to confirm salvation has no basis in Jesus' teachings. Today's prosperity gospel is a fraud. That was 1620. Earnest, communalist, theocratic Protestants came to the United States, the continent of America, I should say, to create a New Jerusalem. 1776 was over 150 years later, about as far distant from 1620 as we are today from the Civil War. By then, things had changed in Europe, and things had changed in Boston. Something else would challenge the vision of those early immigrants. For while the Pilgrims and Puritans were boarding boats, an Englishman in London named Francis Bacon was building something that also had a very promising future: scientific method. Next time, we'll see how that revolution and others brought to 1776 a new, not so Christian vision of this country. Thanks for watching.